Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing something a little different today and diving deep into a book that's all about, well, thinking.
Thinking better, to be more specific.
Right. Thinking better. And not just for ourselves, we'll be looking at how to help others think better too, which is something I think we could all use a little help with.
Absolutely. And the book we'll be using as our guide for this deep dive is Time to Think by Nancy Kline.
Time to Think. Have you read this one before?
Yeah. It's really fascinating. Kline blends personal stories and research with practical advice, and it makes you really question some assumptions about thinking. Like, have you ever considered that just by giving someone your undivided attention, you could actually be making them more intelligent?
Okay, now that's a bold claim. I'm definitely intrigued now. So what's the core idea behind this book?
Well, the central concept is something Kline calls a thinking environment.
A thinking environment. Okay.
Yeah, and this thinking environment is a set of conditions that optimizes thinking, both when you're thinking on your own and when you're working with others.
Interesting. And what are these conditions?
Kline outlines 10 components. Attention, incisive questions, equality, appreciation, ease, encouragement, feelings, information, place, and diversity.
10. Wow, that's a lot to unpack. But the one that jumps out to me right away is attention. I mean, we all know how frustrating it can be when we feel like we're not being listened to.
Oh, for sure.
But Kline is saying that the quality of our attention actually impacts other people's ability to think clearly.
Yeah, exactly. She uses this great phrase, the quality of your attention determines the quality of other people's thinking.
Wow. You know, we tend to think of thinking as this solitary activity, something that happens just in our own heads.
Right.
But Kline is arguing that the way we listen actually affects other people's thinking.
Yeah. She's saying that the way we listen to others has a really profound impact on their ability to think clearly and creatively.
So if we could just learn to listen better, we could actually help people become better thinkers.
Yes. And it might sound kind of radical, but Kline backs it up with tons of real-world examples. Like she tells the story of Andrea. Yeah, Andrea. This woman who wanted to start her own herb-growing business but was feeling stuck. She thought she needed business advice, but it turned out what she really needed was for someone to truly hear her out.
So just by listening attentively without interrupting or giving advice, Kline was able to help this woman, Andrea, figure things out on her own.
Exactly. It's pretty amazing.
I'm starting to see how powerful this could be, but if I'm being honest, the no interrupting part would be really tough for me. I have a really bad habit of finishing people's sentences.
Yeah. I think a lot of us can relate to that.
So does Kline address that in the book?
She does. She calls it infantilization, treating others like children who can't think for themselves.
Infantilization. So even if we have good intentions, like trying to be helpful, finishing someone's sentences or giving advice is actually undermining their thinking.
Yeah, and it can be really subtle, too. It can be things like constant worrying, giving unsolicited advice, or even praising someone for things they already know how to do. Kline says it's surprisingly common, though, and that it's incredibly damaging to people's thinking.
Wow. I can definitely see how that could be true. Are there any other examples of infantilization that she gives in the book? Something that can help us recognize it when we do it?
Yeah. One example that comes to mind is the story of this trainer who says to a participant, "When are you going to start facing the truth?"
Oof. Yeah, I can see how that would make someone clam up. It doesn't exactly create a supportive environment.
Not at all. It's more like an interrogation. And that's the opposite of what a thinking environment's supposed to be. Kline actually talks about something else you might not expect. Codependency.
Codependency. Isn't that more about relationships?
Right. But Kline connects it to thinking.
Okay, how so?
She explains that codependency, this excessive need to please others, can actually stifle independent thought.
That's interesting. I've never thought about it like that.
If you're constantly worried about making other people happy or getting their approval, you're less likely to think critically for yourself or express your own authentic ideas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like your own thinking gets put on hold because you're so focused on what other people want or need. So are there any tools we can use to overcome these thinking blocks?
Oh, yeah. She has lots of tools.
Yeah.
And one of the key tools she talks about are incisive questions.
Incisive questions. We touched on this a little earlier, but I'd love to hear more about it. What are they exactly?
Well, they're questions designed to cut through the assumptions and limiting beliefs that block creative problem solving.
Okay. So they're not just simple yes or no questions.
Right. They're open-ended, and encourage deeper reflection and exploration.
Do you have an example of an incisive question from the book?
Yeah. One example is, if you knew you were vital to this organization's success, how would you approach your work?
That's a really good question. It's not about telling someone what to do or even giving them advice. It's about making them think about their own potential.
Exactly. It's helping them see their own value. It really makes you wonder how often we miss opportunities to ask these kinds of questions.
Yeah, totally. So far, we've been mainly talking about work environments, but how applicable is all this to everyday life?
It's actually applicable everywhere. Kline really emphasizes that these principles can apply to all sorts of situations, from leadership and coaching to personal relationships and families. It's about recognizing the intelligence in everyone and creating spaces where it can come out.
So it's not just about boardrooms and meetings.
Not at all.
We can use this to improve how we communicate with our partners, our kids, our friends.
Absolutely. In fact, Kline has a great anecdote about a mother who used an incisive question to help her daughter work through a conflict she was having with a friend.
Really? What happened?
The daughter was upset because her friend had called her stupid.
Oh, man. Kids can be so brutal.
Right. But instead of just dismissing her daughter's feelings or telling her, "Oh, you're not stupid," she asked her, "If you knew that you are not stupid, that you are actually very intelligent, what would you do about him today?"
Wow. What a great question. I love how it shifts the focus from the hurt feelings to her own intelligence and how she can take control of the situation. Did it work?
Yeah, it did. The daughter was able to move past the hurt feelings and actually come up with a plan to deal with her friend.
Okay, that's incredible. I think we often underestimate kids' ability to think critically and problem solve.
I agree. And that actually reminds me of something else Kline says in the book, that physical punishment is completely incompatible with a thinking environment.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You can't exactly foster independent thinking when fear and obedience are the main motivators.
So it's about creating an environment where kids feel safe to express themselves, even if their thoughts and feelings are different from ours.
Exactly. And that reminds me, we've talked about attention, incisive questions, and touched on infantilization and codependency. But there's still so much to unpack when it comes to the other components of a thinking environment.
You're right. We've only just scratched the surface. Like, the component of place kind of surprised me.
Place? How so?
Well, reading that section, I realized it's not just about having comfy chairs and good lighting. It's about creating a space that conveys respect and value for the people in it.
You're picking up on something really important there. Kline talks about how she once felt stifled in this beautifully designed office and also felt uncomfortable in this, dingy basement classroom. It wasn't about how the places looked. It was about the underlying feeling of not being valued in those spaces.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. We've all been in places where we felt like our thinking was being stifled. Sometimes it's a physical space, like a cluttered office or a stuffy boardroom. And sometimes it's more of an emotional atmosphere, like a tense family gathering where you feel like you can't really be yourself. So, what does a thinking environment look like when it comes to place? What are some good examples?
Kline mentions this London advertising agency where the employees actually helped design the workspace.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's full of natural light, comfy spaces, and they even have a dedicated room for pregnant women to relax.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Right, and it shows that they really prioritize employee well-being.
Yeah. It's a far cry from those sterile cubicles so many of us are used to. It makes you wonder how much more creative and productive we could be if we felt truly valued and comfortable in our workspaces.
You know what? That actually connects to another component, diversity.
Diversity.
Right. Kline's point is that diversity isn't just some feel-good buzzword. It actually makes groups more intelligent. It challenges the assumption that only one dominant group has a monopoly on good thinking.
That's a good point. I can see how different perspectives and experiences could lead to richer discussions and more innovative solutions.
Exactly. And when you embrace diversity, you're breaking free from the limiting belief that only certain people have valuable ideas. Kline talks about how prejudice often leads to the assumption that certain groups can't think.
Right, like there's this unspoken belief that some people are just inherently smarter or more capable than others.
Exactly.
Wow.
And she argues that real diversity helps dismantle those harmful stereotypes.
So it's about acknowledging and valuing the unique contributions of each person, regardless of their background or identity.
Yes. And she highlights how powerful this can be with a story about a woman named Trisha. a brilliant consultant who was struggling to write a proposal.
Trisha, what was she struggling with?
It turned out she had this internalized belief that because she was a working-class Glaswegian Catholic woman, she wasn't good enough.
Oh, wow. That's heartbreaking. I mean, it just shows how deeply ingrained these societal prejudices can be, even within ourselves.
Yeah. But through a series of those incisive questions we were talking about earlier, Kline helped Tricia uncover and challenge that belief.
What happened?
Tricia was able to break through the block she was having and write this amazing proposal.
That's so inspiring, and it reminds me of the importance of attention. Like, just by really listening to Tricia and taking her concerns seriously, Kline was able to help her tap into her full potential.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how all these components work together to create a truly transformative environment. And, as we've been talking about all this, I've been thinking that time to think is about so much more than just, improving our individual thinking skills. It feels like a blueprint for building a better world, starting with how we treat each other.
I love that, and I think it explains why this book has resonated with so many people. It's not just about being smarter, it's about being better as individuals, in our relationships, and as a society.
And Kline takes it even further. She goes beyond these individual interactions and explores how thinking environment principles could revolutionize different areas of life, like healthcare.
Healthcare, how so?
Well, she talks about how doctors often interrupt patients after 20 seconds, which leads to them missing crucial information. It prevents them from creating a space for patients to fully express themselves.
Yeah. That's something I think we've all experienced. You go to the doctor and you feel rushed and unheard, like they're not really listening to your concerns.
Exactly. And she points out how a lot of things contribute to this. The pressure to see more patients, doctors' fears of patients having emotional displays, and even just, the ingrained hierarchy of the medical profession. She argues that doctors need to embrace the thinking environment. Things like listening without interrupting, asking incisive questions, and really valuing the patient's perspective.
It's like we need a whole new model of healthcare that prioritizes genuine care and connection over efficiency and just getting people in and out the door as quickly as possible.
Right. It makes you think, how many misdiagnoses or ineffective treatments could be avoided if doctors just took the time to really listen?
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. And it's not just healthcare that could benefit. Kline also talks about education and how thinking environments could transform the way we teach and learn. Imagine classrooms where teachers actually value students' ideas and encourage them to think for themselves.
Yeah. Can you imagine? Instead of just lecturing the students, the teacher is more of a facilitator who guides them to their own discoveries and insights.
I had a few teachers like that growing up, and they were definitely the ones who made the biggest impact on me. What does Kline suggest could be done differently in education?
Well, for one thing, she advocates for smaller class sizes so teachers can give more individualized attention.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. What else?
Well, she also suggests we could ask more open-ended questions and place more emphasis on critical thinking and collaboration. Get the students really engaged in the learning process, not just memorizing facts and figures.
I'm picturing a classroom that's buzzing with energy and ideas where students are actively involved in shaping their own education. It's a far cry from the traditional model where the teacher is the holder of all the knowledge and the students are just passive recipients.
Exactly. And Kline actually highlights a school like that, this small school that's racially and economically diverse, where the students are really encouraged to express their own thoughts and learn from each other's experiences. It's an amazing example of how a thinking environment can foster not just intellectual growth, but also empathy and understanding.
Okay, so we've talked about healthcare and education, but what about politics?
Politics.
Yeah, can these principles really be applied to something as complex and, let's be honest, often adversarial as politics?
Kline admits it's a challenge, but she sees a ton of potential there too. She criticizes the current political climate where attack and opposition are often prioritized over genuine dialogue and collaboration.
Well, that definitely sounds familiar.
Right. And it often feels like everything is so polarized that there's more focus on winning arguments and scoring points than on actually understanding each other's perspectives.
Yeah. It's like that us versus them mentality has taken over and there's no room for nuance or compromise.
Exactly. So Kline argues that politicians need to embrace these thinking environment principles, not just for the sake of better policymaking, but for the health of democracy itself.
So we're talking about moving away from that us versus them mentality, right?
Yes.
Creating a space for more nuanced and productive conversations about the issues that matter most. I mean, it sounds ideal, but is that even possible given how divided everything is right now?
Yeah. It's definitely a tall order, but Kline thinks it's possible. And she even has some examples that give me hope. She tells this story about an English politician who was deeply moved by the human connection she felt in Parliament right after a colleague died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it made her realize that maybe it shouldn't take a tragedy to break down barriers and encourage real authenticity and empathy in politics.
That's such a powerful example.
It really highlights the power of shared experience and genuine human connection, even in a setting that's often characterized by division and posturing. And it brings us back to the core of what Time to Think is all about, creating spaces where people feel safe to think, speak, and connect on a deeper level. It's not just about improving our thinking skills. It's about fostering a more humane and fulfilling way of being in the world.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked on this idea. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm really curious to hear more about how these principles can play out in our personal relationships. You mentioned earlier that Kline shares examples of couples and families using these techniques. So what does that actually look like?
Okay, well, one couple Kline describes has this really interesting ritual. Every night after dinner, they take turns talking about anything that's on their minds while the other person just listens. No interrupting, no giving advice.
Wow. That's a really simple idea, but I can see how it could be so powerful to feel like you have that dedicated time and space to just be heard by your partner.
Right, and it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
They also schedule regular weekend getaways just to have deeper conversations and do incisive question sessions with each other to help uncover and challenge their limiting beliefs.
Okay, now that's impressive. They're being very intentional about creating that space for connection and growth. And Kline also talks about families as thinking teams, which is so different from that traditional model of the parents being the all-knowing authorities and the children just like following along.
Right, and she argues that when we treat children as thinking equals, it doesn't just improve communication in the family, it empowers the kids to develop their critical thinking skills and make better decisions.
I can see how that could lead to more respectful and fulfilling relationships between parents and children.
For sure.
But I'm also thinking, as a parent, how challenging that can be in practice. How do you encourage independent thought while also setting boundaries and maintaining authority?
That's a great question and one that we can definitely explore further. But before we jump into that, I think it's time to move on and look at some specific examples of how these thinking environment techniques have been used in real-life situations.
Okay, I'm ready for more. This deep dive is already giving me so much to think about.
You know, one of the things that really struck me in Time to Think was Kline's emphasis on the impact these principles can have on children. She shares this really moving story about a mother who used an incisive question to help her young daughter deal with a conflict with a friend.
Oh, those are always so powerful. What happened?
So the daughter was really upset because her friend had called her stupid. And instead of just dismissing her feelings or offering a simple solution, the mother asked, "If you knew that you are not stupid, that in fact you are very intelligent, what would you do about him today?"
Okay, wow, that is so much better than just saying, don't worry, you're smart. It gets her to really think about her own intelligence, not just accepting someone else's assessment of her.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is, it worked. The daughter was able to move past her hurt feelings and come up with a plan to address the situation with her friend.
It's a good reminder that even young children can benefit from these incisive questions.
Yeah.
It makes you think differently about how we interact with kids, you know? Sometimes I think we underestimate their ability to think critically and come up with their own solutions.
I think that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And Kline even goes so far as to say that physical punishment is totally incompatible with a thinking environment.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, you can't really foster independent thinking when fear and obedience are the primary motivators.
You're right. It's about creating a space where children feel safe to express their thoughts and feelings, even if they're different from our own. But before we get too far into parenting, I'm really curious to hear more about those real-world applications we were talking about, especially in healthcare and politics. Those seem like tough areas to actually implement these ideas.
Yeah, you're right. They are challenging areas. In healthcare, Kline talks about how doctors often interrupt patients after just a few seconds.
A few seconds. Wow.
Yeah, and they end up missing vital information. You know, think about when you've been to the doctor. Have you ever felt rushed or like your concerns weren't really heard?
Oh, absolutely. I think most of us have had that experience at some point. You're trying to explain what's going on and the doctor's already cutting you off and jumping to conclusions. It can be so frustrating.
A thinking environment in healthcare would mean doctors actually listening without interrupting asking those incisive questions to really understand your perspective,
Yeah.
and genuinely valuing your input as a patient.
I like that, making the patient feel like a partner in their own care. It really makes you wonder how many misdiagnoses or ineffective treatments could be avoided if doctors just slowed down and listened to their patients.
I know, and it's not just about those individual interactions. Kline talks about how these principles can transform larger systems like education and even politics.
Okay, now politics, that one feels particularly daunting. Can you really imagine politicians embracing these ideas of listening without interrupting, valuing different perspectives, and focusing on collaboration? It just seems like the opposite of how most political discourse happens these days.
I know it's hard to picture. Kline admits it's a really challenging area, but she sees a lot of potential. She criticizes that us versus them mentality that dominates so much of politics today.
It feels like everything is so polarized these days.
Totally.
There's so much focus on winning arguments and scoring points that I think we lose sight of the importance of genuine dialogue and understanding.
Right. Kline envisions a political landscape where politicians actually listen to each other, ask those incisive questions to uncover their shared goals, and really focus on collaboration instead of just attacking each other.
I mean, that sounds amazing, but is it really realistic? I mean, do you think that's something that could actually happen in the real world?
It's a big question.
Yeah. Yep.
But Kline does believe it's possible, and she shares some examples in the book that give me hope. She tells a story about this English politician who was deeply moved by this genuine human connection she felt in Parliament after one of her colleagues passed away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it made her realize that maybe it should take a tragedy like that to break down those barriers and encourage people to be more authentic and empathetic in the political sphere.
That's such a powerful story. It really highlights the potential for connection and understanding, even in a setting that's often so adversarial.
And it brings us back to one of those core messages of time to think. Creating these thinking environments isn't just about improving our thinking skills. It's about creating a more humane and fulfilling way of being in the world. It's about recognizing the intelligence in everyone.
I love that. And I think it's one of the reasons why this book has been so impactful for so many people. It's not just about being smarter. It's about being better as individuals in our relationships and as a society.
You know, as we've been discussing all these different applications, I keep coming back to Kline's focus on personal relationships. She really emphasizes how much these principles can transform the way we interact with our loved ones.
Yeah, we touched on that briefly with the story about the mother and daughter, but I'd love to hear more about what that looks like in adult relationships. Do you have any other examples that come to mind?
One that really stuck with me was about this couple who made a conscious effort to create a thinking environment in their relationship. They started doing this thing where every night after dinner, they would take turns talking about anything that was on their mind while the other person just listened. No interrupting, no advice, just listening.
That's such a simple but powerful idea, just having that designated time and space to feel truly heard by your partner.
Exactly. And they actually took it a step further. They also scheduled regular weekend getaways where they'd set aside time for deeper conversations and even do incisive question sessions with each other.
Wow, that's commitment. Sounds like they're really intentional about creating that space for connection and growth in their relationship.
Yeah, they are. And Kline also talks about how these principles can apply to families, even with young children. She uses the phrase thinking teams to describe families who really embrace these ideas.
That's such a great way to think about it. It's so different from that traditional model of parents as the all-knowing authority figures and the kids just passively following along.
I know. And Kline argues that when we treat children as thinking equals, it doesn't just improve family communication. It also helps the kids develop their critical thinking skills and make more informed decisions.
Okay, I can see how that approach would lead to more respectful and fulfilling relationships between parents and kids. But I'm also thinking about how challenging that could be as a parent. How do you balance encouraging independent thought with setting boundaries and, still being the parent?
That's a great question, and one that a lot of parents wrestle with. Kline does offer some specific techniques for navigating that. But I think the key is to remember that creating a thinking environment isn't about giving up control as a parent.
So it's not about letting the kids run wild and make all the decisions.
Right. It's about creating a space where everyone feels safe and respected enough to share their thoughts and contribute their best thinking.
Okay. I like that. It's about creating a different kind of dynamic where everyone's voice is valued.
Exactly. And that shift in dynamic can be really powerful, not just in families, but in all areas of life.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information, but in a good way. It's like my brain is buzzing with all these new ideas and possibilities.
I know what you mean. It is a lot to take in. But that's the great thing about Kline's work. It's not just theoretical, it's all very practical. She gives us real tools and techniques that we can start using today to create more thinking environments in our own lives.
I'm excited to start putting some of these ideas into practice. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I just wanted to make sure we touch on those remaining components of a thinking environment that we haven't discussed yet. We've covered attention, incisive questions, place, and diversity. So what about those other ones?
Good point. We've talked about listening without interrupting, but Kline also highlights the importance of something she calls ease.
Ease. What's that about?
It's this idea of creating a relaxed and comfortable atmosphere where people feel safe to let their guard down and share their true thoughts.
Oh, yeah, I get that. When you're in a situation where you feel tense or stressed or like you're being judged, it's hard to think clearly.
Exactly. Ease is all about creating the opposite of that. An environment where people feel physically and psychologically comfortable enough to let their minds wander and really explore new ideas.
So it's not just about eliminating distractions like noise and clutter. It's also about fostering a positive and supportive emotional atmosphere.
Yes. And that ties into another component, encouragement. Kline talks about how crucial it is to create a culture of positive reinforcement where people feel supported and appreciated for their contributions.
I can see how that would make a big difference. When you feel encouraged and appreciated, you're more likely to take risks and share your ideas, even if they're a little outside the box.
Exactly. And it's not just about praising people's ideas. It's about acknowledging their effort and valuing their unique perspectives, even if you don't necessarily agree with them.
That reminds me of something you were saying earlier about diversity. That it's not just about having a variety of people in the room, it's about actually valuing their different perspectives.
That's it. And it brings us to another component that's often overlooked. Feelings. Kline argues that emotions are a crucial part of thinking, and that we need to create environments where people feel comfortable expressing their feelings.
Including the messy ones.
Yes, even the uncomfortable ones. I think that could be really challenging for a lot of people, especially in professional settings, where there's this unspoken rule that you have to be rational and unemotional all the time.
It's almost like we're expected to check our feelings at the door when we go to work or school.
Yeah. But Kline makes a really compelling argument that when we try to suppress our feelings, we're actually limiting our capacity to think clearly and make good decisions.
That makes sense. When you're trying to ignore or push down your emotions, it takes up so much mental energy, and it can really cloud your judgment.
Exactly. And allowing space for feelings doesn't mean just letting emotions run wild. It's about acknowledging them, understanding how they influence our thinking, and creating an environment where people feel safe to express them in healthy and constructive ways.
This is all so fascinating. Kline is really giving us a new way to think about communication and collaboration. But we're running a little short on time. What about those last two components, information and equality?
Oh, right. Well, information is pretty straightforward. It's about ensuring that everyone has access to the information they need to think effectively.
Okay. That seems pretty obvious. But I guess it's easy to overlook.
Yeah. Kline points out that we often withhold information either intentionally or unintentionally, and that can really hinder people's ability to think their best.
That's true. I've been in so many meetings where it felt like people were holding back information and it made it impossible to have a productive conversation.
It happens all the time. And then the last component is equality, which is about creating a level playing field where everyone feels like their voice matters.
Okay, so that means no hierarchies, right?
Right. And valuing everyone's contributions, regardless of their position or status.
Right.
And ensuring that everyone has a chance to participate.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, but I'm having a hard time picturing how that would work in practice. Do you have any examples from the book that illustrate how equality can function in the thinking environment?
Yeah. One example is about a company that implemented a new policy where every single employee, regardless of their job title, had a chance to present their ideas directly to the CEO.
Wow, that's pretty radical. I can see how that could lead to some really innovative ideas that might have otherwise been overlooked.
Exactly. It's about challenging that assumption that good ideas only come from the top. When you create a culture of equality, you tap into the collective intelligence of the whole organization.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It's like my brain is buzzing with all these new possibilities.
I know exactly what you mean. It is a lot to process. But the great thing about Kline's work is that it's not just theoretical, it's super practical. She gives us tangible tools and techniques that we can start experimenting with right away.
I'm definitely excited to start playing around with some of these ideas. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to ask if there was anything else from the book that particularly resonated with you. Any memorable stories or insights that you'd like to share?
As we've been talking about all these different pieces of a thinking environment,
Yeah.
I've been trying to remember times when I really felt like my thinking was flowing, you know?
And times when it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Have you been doing that too?
Actually, yeah. I was just thinking about this time when I was working on this really tough project. I was feeling totally stuck and went to my boss for help. But instead of giving me solutions, she asked me all these questions.
What kinds of questions?
I don't remember exactly what she said, but I remember feeling like she genuinely wanted to understand what I was thinking, not just tell me what she thought.
It sounds like she was using those incisive questions.
Yeah, maybe. Honestly, at first I was kind of annoyed, like, just tell me what to do. But as we talked more, I started to see the problem differently and actually felt like I could come up with my own solutions.
That's awesome. She created a mini thinking environment right there in your conversation. And it shows that we can use these principles even in casual interactions, not just in some big formal setting.
It makes them feel a lot less intimidating to try out, that's for sure. So you don't need, like, special training to start using these.
Not at all. And that's one of the best things about Kline's work,
Yeah.
It's for everyone. You don't have to be a CEO or a therapist or anything to benefit from it.
Speaking of therapists, Kline does talk about applying these principles in therapy too, right? How would you say a thinking environment is different from a traditional therapy session?
Well, I don't think it has to replace traditional therapy, but it can really add to it. Like Kline focuses on making the environment super collaborative, so the therapist isn't the expert with all the answers. They're more like a guide, helping the client find their own inner wisdom.
So it's more about empowering the client to figure things out for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And Kline says that can be really powerful for clients, especially ones who have felt unheard or powerless in other therapy settings. Was there anything else in the book that you found particularly interesting or memorable?
There was one story that really got me thinking. It was about a doctor in Uganda who helped develop this revolutionary treatment for meningitis. And at first he was so excited because it was a huge breakthrough.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But then he realized that the drug was going to be way too expensive for the people who needed it most, the people in developing countries, and it made him so discouraged.
That's heartbreaking. He dedicated all this time to helping people, and then the system gets in the way.
It makes you wonder how many great ideas are out there that could really change the world if we just had systems that supported them.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a big part of the challenge Kline leaves us with. To use these principles not just to improve our own lives, but also to change those larger systems, to make them more thinking friendly.
It's definitely a lot to think about. I'm so glad we did this deep dive into time to think. I feel like I have so many new tools and ideas to play around with.
Me too. And if I could just share one last thought from Kline's book, it would be this. To take time to think is to gain time to live.
I love that. So listener, as you're going about your day, we encourage you to find some time to think. Think about your own assumptions. Think about how you're listening to the people around you. And think about how you can create more of those thinking environments for yourself and everyone you interact with. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.